So with these what are termed as these enclosures acts, right? The First of all, it becomes very with this sort of development of expansion of capital, right, in the hands of that's very higher concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer landowners. There's a lot of development of farming techniques, right? It's very important to keep in mind the sort of technological developments that this is part of it. Once again, we have the scientific sort of another whole scientific revolution. The 17th century is the century of science, and this goes along with a lot of technical developments. And that means farming. In the old days, right, we had these sort of enclosures, right, in which we can have sort of the small time farmers. They do not earn significant amounts of money, but they can make a living on a sort of a small parcel of land in the enclosures, right, which are sort of public lands, right. And with with this great economic expansion, which we have said is associated with these sort of developments in finance, right, okay, leading to debt for the English state, and also development of the colonies, right. We have a development of sort of industrial, it's not quite industrial yet, but it's sort of agricultural, farming, we should say, becomes more and more industrial, and this sort of squeezes out the small time farmer, right, and it is really comes to a head, and it first of all becomes much more difficult for these small time farmers to become competitive, and once this continues in Parliament, right? Notice that is only dominated by it's only there are only really the Whigs and the Tories that are represented here. There's a series of laws that are passed to sort of confiscate this land, right? These common lands, and that is what these Enclosures Act are about, right? So, and it is argued that these peasant farmers are incapable of exploiting them in the fullest way, and this is sort of the downside of this sort of the triumph of rationalism, because the Whig politicians are capable of sort of arguing that they should be allotted the use of these lands. They're basically confiscated, stolen. We could say stolen from the people. It's sort of when we talk about privatizations today, it's kind of very similar arguments. It's important to put these things in perspective. It's very conceivable that you could get a set of documents that discusses this, right? The privatization of, let's say, British Rail under Blair and the enclosures, right? There would be interesting echoes that you could find there, right? But anyway, we have the justification on the part of members of Parliament, mostly Whigs. There are some Tories, because they're sort of a band of thieves at this time, on this question. But there is sort of a consensus to sort of take this land and exploit it, and this leads, of course. I want to say that this is extremely important. Karl Marx makes it. He in his masterpiece, in his Capital. This is a big chapter in his Capital, Enclosures, and this leads to the fact that of course, once this land is more or less stolen, we have the small time farmers are sort of led. A lot of them are led to seek their fate in towns, right? And that really fuels, right, they can work as they can work for. They're no longer their own boss, right? They can work for a sort of a more industrial farm, right? And then there's, of course, notice at this time here we're talking about sort of the mid-end of the 18th century. Towards the end of the 18th century, we have the invention of the steam engine. We have a lot of industrial, great developments in the development of copper and steel, and we have the explosion of factories. And it's important to note that by the way, the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, we're not really going to be talking about sort of big factories per se, but this is usually excluded to sort of the textiles, right? The textile industries, whereas usually textiles were done in piecework by individuals, often women, right? Of let's say farmers or farm workers. Their wives would weave at home and then sell their product right, to a middleman, right? Um, uh, later, with this no longer became with the development of it's important to know that we have a lot of developments in the United States. Later, we'll have the cotton gin, but with developments of weaving looms, it's much becomes much more profitable to have you know textile manufacturers where workers actually go and work on the hour, right? Okay, and that is sort of the first wave of there's once again it's a move away from sort of uh, private workers who actually own their means of production, right? Even if it only be but a private worker cannot buy these enormous weaving looms, right? That are sort of industrial, right? They don't have the capital do this. The people have the capital because of all these financial tools that were developed over the 18th century. Are this sort of rising merchant class that they can make the capital investment, right, to create a factory, right, and have the workers come and work there. So that's it's a whole dynamic that is happening. This comes to a much greater head with sort of in the this a whole new scale. Where that's sort of the first wave, right? Okay, which we see at sort of the end of the 18th century. It comes to a much greater scale in sort of in the 19th century, sort of in the Victorian period. The Victorian period, by the way, is going to be from 1830 to, let's say, we can say technically speaking, 1901, the death of Queen Victoria. But here we have the huge expansion of uh, um, English imperialism, and once again, this is related to a much greater expansion of the colonies, the empire, because the colonies consume, they have the huge markets for their products, um, and I want to, so that is sort of important to see what is going on, right? The sort of shift in, uh, I would say that's sort of the backdrop of what's going on, and with this enormous expansion, this enormous change in life as everyone becomes sort of a, the as they become working on, the factory worker is sort of a staple in Victorian society, and they're working in it's difficult for us to imagine the working conditions, they're working more than 12 hours a day. There's a series of work laws that are passed. Um, that's a huge change in British society. And if you read any novel, whether it be Dickens, whether it be, I don't know, um, it could be by Charlotte Bronte, whatever the case, it's this sort of this leads to really the class struggle, and once again I talk about this struggle for representation in the 19th century, and that's a major part of what's going on now. Now I would like to talk about, now given sort of that, that sort of backdrop, I'd like to put that into relation to, I want to sort of put it in relation to sort of what we could talk about aesthetics or styles, because I think that's where it really gets interesting, and you're much better able to sort of discuss the documents you get, right? So first of all, as far as changes, we've talked about the fact that we have sort of the triumph, the 1688, right? Is sort of the triumph of science and rationalism, right? Okay, and this sort of continues, right? The triumph, the march of science does not stop, right? And it's really interesting to think of what is progressive and what isn't. That sort of changes. But I would say there's sort of great optimism about this in 1688, but there are kind of reactions to the triumphs of science that are reflected in a lot of sort of art, I would say writing styles, and in we could even say sort of aesthetic movements, right? So I'm going to try to hopefully give you some keys, and this should apply to just about anything you get. I'm trying to give you things that can make you sort of give you a key to sort of unlock anything from these periods, okay? So we're saying that the triumph of rationalism, let's say we can situate that in 1688. And towards the end of the 18th century, right, there becomes, there's a sense of unease about, how perfect this new sort of scientific rationalistic society is, right? There are some misgivings about this, right? Um, and this can kind of be reflected aesthetically. There's actually the development of people called the sort of political group known as sort of the radicals, right? And this political group are going to be critical of they're going to be critical of what are we going to say? For example, it's colonial wars, this kind of thing, and they're going to they're going to champion the cause of the lower classes and one example of this we can talk about, for example, of we can talk Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes Vindication for the Rights of Women. This is sort of late 18th century, and so there's this idea that in 1688 people are much more less critical of sort of the merits of rationalism, right? Whereas their misgivings begin really to be felt, well, I'm simplifying, but more significantly felt towards sort of the middle of the 18th century, and that's sort of the first the first sort of beginnings of what is known as Romanticism, right? So it's and hopefully, so it's important to be able, if you might, for example, this is important to note because you're very likely from this period you might get I've included some lists of painters. You might get a painting from sort of Constable or Gainsborough, and you might get. It's important to be able to sort of show that there's a notice there's this idea. There's a lot of sort of landscapes, right? And there's this sort of a sort of a romantic yearning for sort of an individual to be sort of in nature without the society becomes to be perceived as something more oppressive in a rationalistic society. We can see that people are kind of led to work in sort of horrible conditions, and even if you're let's say a Whig politician, you're sort of organized in political parties in such a way that people become a lot disillusioned with the organization of society. So that's actually really a big part of the rationalistic movement, right? And so so there's a lot of a greater accent stress on the individual, and in these paintings, it's you're likely to see an individual alone in nature, which is something you would never really see. Nature was sort of a backdrop before, and it was sort of we could say that it was completely artificial. It's important to note that for the first time towards the end of the 19th century, painters are they're actually painting in nature, right? Constable being one of the first painters to do this. Whereas if you look back towards the 17th century of someone like Van Dyck, you can have, let's say, a portrait of, let's say, Charles I. Nature is sort of artificial. It's sort of a decor, right? Okay, and if the king is going to have sort of attributes which always are a very firm reminder of his role in society, right? Okay, it's not going to be sort of an individual alone in nature, right? Which that's sort of a novelty, and along with this, is there is part of another criticism of this of this a rationalistic society that is a part of the Romantic movement is a sort of a greater stress laid on the emotions, right, of sentiment. And for example, this shift can be seen even in sort of what here we're talking about the Enlightenment, right? Okay, if we are to read, for example, if you compare, we've talked about John Locke, the real triumph of rationalism. If we compare to John Locke to, say, sort of Hume, the Scottish, who is also largely rationalist in his mindset, in his presenting of things, who is also an Enlightenment philosopher, but Hume, he's actually he's focused on the importance of sentiment, and meaning that there are some things that you can only know. He's still an empirical philosopher. He's talking about the source of knowledge is experience, but he is not out to sort of try to isolate the merits of the I would say the subject for Locke, if we compare it, is going to be a rational thinking person, right? For example, I have to make this a little bit clearer to give more specific examples. In his treatise on human understanding, we have Locke is going. He for example is going to say that to talk about, for example, what is the self, right? he's going to compare the waking and the dreaming self, and he's going to say, well, if you're dreaming, you're not really you, right? Because you're not going to really make rational decisions. You're not going to really decide what to do. You're not a real subject. With a subject is someone who is capable of making, as an agent, is capable of deciding to do things rationally and making calculations. And you don't act like that in a dream, so that's not really you, right? And also, as far as things that, let's say, the memory, he's going to say that if you don't, things that you don't really remember are not part of yourself. We can think about this, is very different from a Freudian conception of the self, right? So the idea is the self is sort of everything you sort of understand and know and have a sort of a firm grasp of, right? Whereas Hume is going to, and so Hume later on, right? Or Hume is writing later on in the 18th century. He's going to say there's actually some things that we can only know, by sentiment, right? So there's a sort of this idea of the validity of feeling, right? Which was sort of not really taken into account in towards the end of the 17th century, which is a more perfectly rationalistic age, right? And so it's important to see that that's that shift, that is really sort of a significant shift towards a romantic mindset, which is really reflected, it's important to know it's reflected in the writing styles. We can say the writing style kind of loosens up again. So we could say in painting, we can kind of say that painting kind of loosens up again, right? Okay. Notice that, and this becomes, if you can go even look further, if you look at someone, let's say Turner, right? Notice we can always think of we can think of the idea of something being clear. We can look at sort of the clarity that is apparent in sort of like an early, even this is actually kind of, even from some, many romantic painters, it's a difficult thing to actually be too definite about. But we can say that in general, there's sort of a greater clarity in what is depicted, which reflects a rational mind, right? So we're talking about and there's an aesthetics of clarity that kind of, that goes hand in hand with a heavy valorization of sort of the rationalistic principle. Whereas you go sort of a painter like Turner, right, in the early 19th century, who's much more of a romantic aesthetic, things are really blurry, and we get the feeling that we don't have a clear sight. We're much more interested in sort of transmitting sort of instead of something that everyone can clearly see and identify with, where we get the feeling that we're really much more interested in transmitting sort of the unique experience of an individual that's kind of hazy in its uniqueness, right? There is this idea of clarity, it becomes less privileged, right? Okay, and that's something that you can really bring to bear in, I would say, writing styles. Now, let's say, for example, if you're going to let's say if you read a writer from the 17th to the 18th century, people say that the 18th century is the century of prose. I'm thinking of anyone you could read. There's a whole host of authors you could read. You're going to come across, the sentences are extraordinarily well constructed. It's actually really well written. There is this principle of clarity is really comes to the fore. Everything kind of fit. All the sentences kind of still fit really neatly into place. Whereas if you're going to compare this, let's say we're coming into the 19th century, a writer, let's say like Carlyle, we have a sort of a much more energetic, we have longer sentences, we have a greater deal of energy, which is part of this romantic. We have greater attention paid to sort of, emphasis on a sort of more intense mood, right? And this comes through in sort of more adjectives, right? Longer sentences and more complicated, more complex sentences with, it's not always clear if you have the subordinate clause where it goes. So hopefully if you're listening to this, you can say, oh, I see. That's a stylistic observation. You can look at a sentence. That's really good when you're analyzing, a set of documents. Say, let's look at this sentence. Look at the grammar of the sentence. Look at the fact that it has three subordinate clauses that are kind of loosely stitched together, right? Whereas we can compare this in our earlier document from the 17th century. We can see we feel that this is written in a much more rationalistic period. Now that you can hopefully see that can apply to, a great variety of documents, and that can really make you, really point out to really important differences, because you're supposed to compare and contrast these documents. So I hope that makes some sense to you. You can really apply this to really, I would say, if you can apply this to most any 19th century, writer. And let's say this also comes true, and I would say this would be incomplete without the mention of sort of a lot of what I'm talking about can be kind of summed up with when we talk about the opposition between what is called the beautiful and the sublime, right? And the beautiful is sort of more of a classical, I would say, something for the more, more rationalistic principle of what is. It's a question of sort of order. There notices a great hearkening to things that are sort of like, if you read sort of things that derive from Virgil and the four seasons, and this question of sort of really balanced equilibrium between components. When we look at, let's say, you could even talk about the composition of a painting, right? Okay, and we could say that this is what is, this is then an aesthetic category called the beautiful, right? And it is more associated with this earlier period, right? Everything is kind of notice we're talking about manners. Everything's kind of well mannered and it kind of fits into place. Whereas this shift towards the sublime, right? We have, as far as in the colors, we might have starker contrast in colors, right? There might be a greater intensity, right? Okay, we're talking about, notice the greater stress laid on the emotion, which might be brought out by sort of contrast and sort of perspective and color, right? And it's sort of this more intense individual experience, right? And that is what is going to be referred to as the sublime. And I'm going to be editing this document. I've sent you, and there's actually there's a really significant document written on that by Edmund Burke called, he has a reflection on the sublime. And so the sublime, even though it's sort of from coming from ancient literature, it's a really convenient, I think, way for you to, talk in a meaningful way about any kind of, whether it be a text or a painting, any kind of document from this period. You'll be able to really talk about these kind of two styles that really are really present, I would say, in just about any text or document from this period. And hopefully you'll be able to, maybe you can review this. There's so much of a keywords that you can go through to saying, sort of say, significant contrast. That we have this idea that we have, a lone figure in nature, and it's sort of, it's actually, and there's this sort of the greater sense of fear and awe, and very sort of grander, right? It's sort of it's more intense, right? Then the beautiful is sort of a more social, well-mannered, more contained, right? And it's more associated with the rationalistic society. Okay, so hopefully that is useful. Hopefully you find this useful, and maybe I would just like to sort of continue this with sort of, more considerations on sort of aesthetics, because I want to make sure that you feel like you have a pretty wide panel of, what kind of text you're going to be encountered with. Something you might be encountered with here will be likely be, it's important to note that, I'm trying to put any kind of document you get, trying to show the different ways you can put documents in relationship with these kind of, what's changing in society, right? So another thing, and so I've talked about the beautiful, the sublime. That'll be really important. Talk about sort of the developments in landscape painting, and how this can be related to the birth of industrialism. It's also important to note that Romanticism is really a reaction to, right, the sort of the industrial age. But until there were factories, people didn't really think it was that interesting to go to nature, right? It's sort of a counter reaction to that, right? Nature wasn't that interesting until, factories came about. And that is, of course, what you should really keep in mind if you get a text from, let's say, any of, let's say, the 6 great English Romantic poets. Right now, we should, just to remind you of who they are, I'm sure you're aware of, like, Wordsworth and Coleridge. They write that one of the one of the seminal texts is going to be, they wrote together their lyrical ballads in 1797. I know it's just important to note that, well, first of all, it's important to note that Wordsworth was in charge of what was the natural realm, sort of the nature. Most of what is referred to as the nature poetry is going to be written by Wordsworth, and he's really, because of this sort of development as, of sort of fact town life, he really reacts to this, and sort of they talk about the merits of going in what they call Grasmere, or the Lake District, right, which is in sort of in the Lancashire and the northwest country of England. They're talking about the merits of sort of being alone in nature, right? Okay. Whereas Coleridge he writes what he calls the sort of the supernatural elements, and he's going to be writing something like Kubla Khan or the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But here, notice he's more involved in these sort of otherworldly, intense, emotional, sort of supernatural experiences. It's not always as clear as that, but that's the general tendencies. Okay, so we have this sort of development of, first of all, there's romantic poetry, which can be largely considered to be a reaction to the evils of this sort of overly rationalistic factory society, and you can really apply this to almost any romantic work. By the way, it's important to note that as far as verse forms, we have the couplet, which you said sort of what is referred to as the French couplet, which is iambic pentameter, right? Which is really the most, it's sort of like l'Alexandrin in French, which is sort of the most regular verse form. Notice this becomes not really replaced. It's not so accurate, but we can say the ballad, right, which is an 8-syllable line. Right, notice the iambic pentameter is a 10-syllable line. The ballad, and is also more of sort of a more popular in the sense, for sort of a lower sort of, this is sort of considered to be more of inspired by songs by sort of people from lower social origins. It's important to note that people write more ballads, right, starting in the Romantic period than they did in the pre-Romantic period, right? So there's sort of a social element there too. So that's something to that you're really likely to come across. Pay attention to that verb form. Is this written in ballad form, right? Or is this written in, or are we dealing here with iambic pentameter, right? Which is sort of a more noble birth form, right? So that can be exploited, right, significantly. I want to make sure that I'm not forgetting things, but just keep in mind that you can really apply that to most things. Now I'm going to need to, I think we'll stop here for this week. This is going to go on. I just that's enough, I think, for this installation. There are already more things that you can say, but I think that if you are aware of that, I think you will hopefully be able to kind of field anything that comes your way. I want to make sure I'm looking out to see if I sometimes I can. I'm going to make sure that everything. There's some things I haven't mentioned. I don't think. I think I've given you the essential. You can look up some of these things yourself. Oh yeah, I wanted to talk about. Yes, the sentimental novel and the Gothic novel. That'll be a good way to put a close to this. So we've talked about sort of romantic poetry. We talked about Wordsworth and Coleridge. I could have talked about Blake. I could have talked about Keats. I could have talked about Byron or Shelley. They're kind of the 6 great romantic poets. The most conservative, which might have been Lord Byron, reflected by his verse forms. Okay. And then we want to talk about the rise of the sentimental novel. That's really important. So notice the first sentimental novel, once again, Romantic age, we have sort of a sentiment, think of Hume is going to say that there's some things we can only know through feeling, not just through being rational, right? And the best example of this is what is known as the sentimental novel. Now, the first one is written by Richardson, right? And it's called Pamela. Don't read it because I haven't read it because it's too long. I've started it, but it's more than 3,000 pages. It's an epistolary novel, which is one of the, and it really was kind of the most important novel even in the continent, at this time. Now, and this novel is about. Notice it's really important that we have the main character Pamela is a woman. Now she is from sort of lower middle classes. She's a servant for sort of a rich rich noble, and it's sort of her rise, we could say, to her, the way that she resists the temptations of Lovelace is the name of her boss, to become to thrive. We'll say that that's enough. But it's important that they're in these sentimental novels. These are epistolary. There's going to be the trope of the woman crying as she's writing about the hardships of her life, and it's really important to know that by the way, the people who are reading these are often the daughters of the newly rising merchant class, right? So that's an important thing to me. That the sentimental novel is a big part of this, and this actually becomes kind of criticized. Pamela, this is sort of satirized. If you have someone like Shamila is going to be a satire of this. And Jane Austen satire is very, when she writes, Sense and Sensibility, it's sort of there's more some satirical of elements. She has some distance with respect to this. So that's really important to note that the value of sentiment is part of the sentimental novel, right? And it's important to note that Richardson is sort of a preacher. His whole goal is sort of educate women, which is kind of a crazy goal. And he's feeling this is a way to educate women is to use of the sentimental novel. It's important to say how this can be termed, but it's important that sentiment is used to this event. He's actually sort of this can be compared to sort of a way of preaching. It's a way to instruct. That's really important to notice. The other thing to notice would be what was called the Gothic novel. I talked about sort of the sublime. It's important to note that we have Horace Walpole, right, is sort of one of the leading kind of Whig minister in the beginning of the 18th century, and his son is the sort of the inventor of the Gothic novel. That he lived in the sort of the Strawberry Fields mansion, which is sort of this this sort of fantastic Baroque mansion that he created, and in the Gothic novel there's sort of a big exploitation of sort of fear, right? There's interesting things written about it, but to sort of try to sum up the essential of this, and a lot of these elements, kind of these tropes, come through in a lot of it. This way you have you can really have your handle on all the different kind of elements that are going to be likely to be present in any of these kind of texts. But we have this idea of, very often we have the figure of the lone woman who is going to be sort of trapped in a castle, and there is going to notice the castle is it's going to be a decrepit old castle, which sort of illustrates the end of the Tory landlord in a sense, right? It could go a little bit farther than that, but still sort of the old system, we could say, is sort of decrepit and coming to an end, and it's sort of dangerous for a young woman, and it's sort of the end of this certain form of paternalistic society. But it's important to note that once again that there's sort of there's a lot of illusion, right, and sort of there's a lot of play on the fear and emotion. Sort of this is sort of the sublime is at play, and yet once again it can sort of at the end it's learned that that things aren't really what at night when you wander in the castle, what you might imagine, which in your unbridled imagination, which is no longer ruled by the rationalistic principle. You might think that you imagine that there's sort of ghosts, but it's actually there's always sort of a rational explanation behind it. So it's once again, you will be able to. I wouldn't be at all surprised if something from that period will be able to fall in that category. So the sort of main new, it's interesting to note that the new kind of genres that come into being are the sentimental novel and the Gothic novel and sort of romantic poetry, right? And they all illustrate sort of these tensions, right? And hopefully you will be able to relate it to these things as you go along. So we'll stop it there. Sorry, that is a long explanation. I'm probably going to skip forward. We're going to move to sort of, as far as next week, we'll just go over the I would say the England from we'll see how the sort of the whole England we know today really we only start to begin to see this sort of starting from the post-war period, after the first war. And I will also send you, hopefully you will see the other document that will talk more about the method that you can use, hopefully to put you at ease. I don't think this exercise is as hard as you might think it is. I think you'll be okay. But I will give you some of the method that you can use to analyze your set of documents. So take care. Have a good week.